Maybe you're exhausted, but still calling it faith. Maybe you've cried alone at night, but keep waking up saying everything's okay because someone needs to believe that God is still in control. And He is. But maybe not in the way you imagine. Maybe that control is no longer on the path you insist on following, because sometimes God closes the door, but we keep knocking, we keep praying, we keep fasting, we keep trying, because you've learned that giving up is a lack of faith. But there's a fine and dangerous line between faith and spiritual stubbornness. Some people confuse perseverance with faithfulness, but what you call faithfulness could be resistance. What you call a trial could be a warning. What you call a calling could be an emotional attachment disguised as a mission. And this is tiring. It's tiring because your heart knows, but your mind doesn't accept it. Because your soul cries out, but you silence it with verses that serve more to justify your permanence than to obey what God signaled long ago. This path is over, but you're still there, clinging, waiting, resisting. Do you know what hurts? It's that you're not in sin. You're not distant, you're not rebellious. You're trying to get it right. But you're trying where there's no grace left. You're fighting where the blessing has already been withdrawn. And this is confusing because you pray and heaven is silent. You help and keep getting hurt. You wait, but everything inside you feels abandoned. But it's not abandonment, it's guidance. But you don't want to listen, because listening will mean letting go, and letting go hurts more than insisting. The truth is, God has already given you permission to stop. He's already given you signs. He's already given you peace, not the kind that numbs you, but the kind that frees you. But you still insist. And in this video, I'll show you the 5 spiritual signs most often ignored by those who are being called to leave but still want to stay. Because God won't force you to leave, but He won't bless your resistance either. He wants your surrender. And today, perhaps, is the day to recognize it's not that you've lost faith. It's that you're fighting against direction. Before diving into this profound message, I want to ask you one thing. If this word touched your heart just by the title, if you feel God has been speaking to you about difficult changes, stay with me until the end. Because this video isn't just a reflection, it's spiritual guidance. And it may be exactly what your soul has been silently waiting for. If you know someone who is persisting on a path that has lost its peace, share this video with love. Someone may need this liberation as much as you do. And if this channel has been a source of comfort and clarity in your life, subscribe, activate the bell, like, and leave a comment. They motivate us in this mission. Here, every word is prepared in prayer to reach hearts like yours. Let's go together. Because God speaks even in silence. Emotional attachment disguised as a spiritual mission. It's not always faith. It's not always purpose. Sometimes it's just fear of letting go. You say you were called to be there, that God planted you in this place, that you have a mission. But inside you, something has already broken, it's already ruptured, it's been silent for too long. And yet you persist. Because you've learned to confuse attachment with fidelity. You've learned to resist as if it were obedience, when in truth it's just your soul trying to avoid another loss. The body gives signs, the heart gives signs, but you call it a test, a struggle, a spiritual war. You say God is molding you, but the truth is you're getting sick inside because there's a weariness that doesn't come from the enemy. It comes from the resistance to accepting that God has already shown you that this is no longer the way. And resistance tires. Resistance makes you sick. Resistance steals the lightness of faith and turns the mission into a prison. A prison you maintain yourself for fear of disappointing a God who has already set you free. It's hard to admit that what was once God's direction may now have become nothing more than our insistence. Jonah knew he was a prophet. He knew God was speaking to him, but he resisted the call, not out of weakness, but out of pride. He didn't want Nineveh. He didn't want to follow a path that violated his will, and pride disguises itself well. It dresses itself in fidelity, in purpose, in responsibility, and you, who have always given of yourself, who have always wanted to do the right thing, end up believing that continuing is what pleases God. But there's a phrase that needs to echo in your spirit. You're not fighting for faith, you're fighting against direction. It's not disobedience, it's fear. Fear of letting go, fear of being judged, fear of hearing you made a mistake. But God isn't accusing you, He's calling you to rest, to let go of what no longer bears fruit, to understand that true mission doesn't drag you down, it pulls you toward the light. And maybe today is the day to accept you were not called to carry what God has already asked you to leave behind. Because when the soul insists on where God has already withdrawn His grace, the weight increases, but His presence diminishes. And there is no victory where His presence has already withdrawn. The silence of God that is not absence, but a sign of redirection. Have you ever wondered why heaven has become so quiet? Why does that sense of presence that once guided you now seem distant? Why, even when praying, fasting, serving, everything seems dry, colorless, and unanswered? Perhaps because the answer has already been given. And now, God is silent not out of absence, but out of redirection. There comes a time when God stops repeating what He's already said. He's given you signs, shown you closed doors, taken away the peace of certain conversations, made you feel strange in places that were once your refuge. But you keep going, you keep waiting for Him to confirm what your heart has already decided, and when He doesn't, you call it proof. But maybe it's not proof. Maybe it's a warning. It's a rare but profoundly biblical concept. God is silent not to punish, but to reveal whether you walk by conviction or simply by confirmation. Whether you only follow when everything is clear, or whether you are able to walk when He simply points and then falls silent. Because faith isn't about having everything explained. Faith is about continuing even when the sky is silent, but your heart still burns for the truth. And there's a difference between peace and comfort. Not every absence of conflict is peace. Sometimes it's just accommodation. It's staying where it's safe, where you're known, where you're not challenged to obey something that hurts your ego. And just like the rich young man, you look at Jesus with admiration, but you leave sad because you don't want to let go of what binds you. He wanted to follow, but he didn't want to let go. You're asking God to speak, but you've blocked your ears with your own desires. You're crying out for an answer, but you've already defined what you want to hear. And that's not prayer, it's subtle spiritual manipulation. It's wanting God to simply bless what you don't want to let go of. But His silence is proof of His love. Because He won't compete with your attachments. He will remain silent until you have the courage to listen to what you already know. Stop and remember, when was the last time you had clarity? What has changed since then? What entered your heart that drowned out that conviction that was once so alive? Sometimes God's silence is a stronger answer than any audible word. He is redirecting you, not because He has rejected you, but because He loves you too much to leave you where grace no longer exists. And in this silence, He is preparing the sound of true peace, the kind that only comes after obedience, when prayer becomes a crutch to avoid action. There are times when prayer is no longer a search, it's an escape. You pray, and that's good. You fast, and that's sacred. But deep down, you know that what's keeping you stuck isn't faith, it's fear. Fear of facing what's already clear. Fear of facing what's already been shown. fear of letting go of what hurts, but still brings a false sense of control. And in that silent place of the soul, prayer ceases to be communion and becomes a crutch, a spiritual excuse for not acting. How many times have you said, "I'm waiting on God"? And how many of those times did you know that waiting was actually a hiding place? A hiding place from the difficult decision, a hiding place from the truth that unsettles you, a hiding place from the step God has already asked you to take, but you still don't have the courage to take. Waiting has become an alibi, and you've convinced yourself that not moving is spiritual, when in fact it's emotional. The heart knows when it's being disobedient yet clothed in reverence. It knows when it's postponing what's already been revealed. It knows when prayer has become a disguise. God has already spoken. He's already shown. He's already closed doors, taken away peace, and instilled discomfort. And yet you pray expecting new direction, when in truth you simply haven't accepted the one that came. You're waiting for an answer that already came, but it wasn't the one you wanted. This phrase may hurt, but it heals because it frees us from the illusion that praying always postpones the pain of obedience. Sometimes God answers with a go, and you want him to say, "Stay." Sometimes he says, "End," and you want to hear, "Insist a little longer." But God doesn't tailor his answers to our needs. He speaks what heals, not what comforts the ego. Remember Moses before the sea. He prayed, he cried out, and God said, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the people to march." In other words, I've said enough. Now it's time to obey, to get up, to go, because there is a time to pray. And there is a time to act on prayer. Faith isn't just a bended knee, it's a moving foot. Look at the decisions you haven't made. Reflect on the no's you haven't said yet, the closures you've avoided, the paths you keep trying to reopen. What are you holding on to that you should have let go of by now? What are you calling direction but are merely hesitation in sacred language? Because prayer connects you to God, but obedience puts you on the path he has prepared. And that path begins when you stop running from the answer you didn't want, but needed to hear. A pattern of repeated suffering that you call fidelity. You're still there, always there, carrying the weight that hasn't been shared, enduring recurring pain, keeping alive a hope that only you sustain. And you call it fidelity, you call it proof of love, you call it spiritual commitment. But what you don't see or don't want to see is that this repetition of suffering may not be purposeful. It may be imprisonment. There's a fine line between being faithful and being emotionally imprisoned by a cycle disguised as a mission. When the heart insists on saving what God has already asked to be released, suffering becomes a spiritual addiction. And that hurts, because every time you try to lift someone who doesn't want to be lifted, you sink with them. Every time you try to rekindle a flame in a place God has already extinguished, the smoke blinds you. You think you're being like Christ, that you're loving as he loved, that you're suffering as he suffered. But Jesus also knew how to withdraw. He knew how to be silent. He knew how to let go. And you who have a generous heart, who weep in silence, who pray more for others than for yourself, you need to remember that you were not called to destroy yourself, trying to save those who don't want to be saved. Samson was warned. The signs were there, but he persisted in Delilah even though he knew she represented destruction. Even seeing the danger, he remained, because desire was greater than discernment. And so it is with you. You keep investing where everything drains you. You keep praying where everything wears you down. You keep saying everything is fine while your soul cries out for help. And that's not fidelity. It's spiritual exhaustion. Not all suffering has glory. Some have a warning. A warning that you're in the wrong place, with the wrong people, fulfilling a mission God didn't give you, but one you assumed out of guilt, fear, attachment. And this kind of pain doesn't transform you. It consumes you. It dries you out. It silences you. It makes you doubt your own faith. Because it's not the pain of the cross, it's the pain of persistence. There are times when God calls you out, not because you failed, but because you've already accomplished your duty, or because you should never have entered. And if you continue to suffer in the same way, for the same reasons, with the same results, maybe it's not a test, maybe it's a cycle. And a cycle is only broken with obedience, not with more effort, not with more faith, with obedience. Obedience to a God who has already told you you don't need to sacrifice for this anymore. Because the fidelity that wounds the soul doesn't come from God. It comes from guilt. And God doesn't blame, He frees. The false peace that in reality is fear of the new. You say you're at peace, that you no longer feel that conflict, that everything is calm now, but inside everything is paralyzed. Nothing flourishes, nothing pulses, nothing moves, and this peace you feel may not be God's peace. It may just be an emotional numbness, an inner silence born of fear, fear of starting over, fear of facing something new, fear of leaving the place that has accustomed you to pain disguised as stability. It's subtle, it's profound, and it's dangerous, because you begin to confuse the absence of struggle with the presence of God. You begin to think you're at peace, when in fact you're merely resigned. Your soul is numb, your faith is dormant, and you call spiritual maturity what is merely emotional survival. But true peace doesn't paralyze. The peace that comes from above propels, moves, frees, gives lightness, gives clarity, brings presence. And God's presence never numbs, it awakens. Abraham left Ur without knowing where he was going, but he did. It was because he felt a faith that moved him, a direction that wasn't logical but was real. What about you? You've called peace what deep down is fear of losing control, fear of making a mistake again, fear of suffering again, and so you prefer to stay where you are, even if nothing grows there anymore, even if your soul has already paled in that place. The people of Israel experienced this. God led them out of Egypt, showed them the promised land, but they still felt safer in the desert. Why? Because the new is frightening. Freedom demands responsibility, the promise demands movement, and the desert, though arid, was familiar. It was predictable, and the weary soul often prefers the familiar that hurts to the unknown that liberates. So ask yourself, does this peace bring me closer to God or paralyze me in the face of what He has promised me? Is this feeling of tranquility a fruit of the Spirit or a shield against fear? Because God's peace brings life. It renews faith. It warms the heart. It inspires new steps. If your peace has frozen you, perhaps it isn't peace. Perhaps it's fear dressed up as a costume. And what God wants to give you isn't emotional comfort. It's living guidance. He doesn't want you to just accept what's safe. He wants you to obey what's right, and what's right often takes you from the place that once settled your soul, but dried up your spirit. Because peace that paralyzes doesn't come from God. It comes from a soul that has given up on dreaming. And God is saying, don't settle for this desert. There's a promised land waiting for your yes. When you insist where God has already ended, some doors close loudly, others silently. But there are those that God closes, and you keep trying to force them with prayers, with effort, with promises that this time it will work out. And it doesn't. Because the time for that place, that mission, that person has already ended. But the resistant soul still wants to reopen what heaven has already sealed. You think you're being tested. You think God is testing your faith. But in reality, you're just fighting the end of a season, trying to keep alight a flame that God Himself extinguished. And this effort is tiring. It's exhausting. It sickens the body, the mind, the spirit. Because keeping alive what God has already ended requires superhuman effort, and when you stop for even a moment, everything collapses. because it wasn't sustained by grace. It was sustained by your insistence. God never asked you to be the maintainer of something he himself withdrew his hand from. He never commanded you to hold an empty throne. Saul did this. He was anointed, rejected, and yet he insisted on remaining on the throne. He insisted on a place where his presence no longer existed, and the more he insisted, the more he lost himself. The more he consumed himself, until he ended in destruction. You may be experiencing something similar, maintaining a position, a relationship, a mission that no longer has any life, only appearance, only weight. And deep down, you know it, because the exhaustion you feel is not the result of spiritual battle. It's the result of a path that has ended. When God is involved, fatigue exists, but it bears fruit. When God has left, fatigue only consumes, but does not transform. And here's a liberating truth. God doesn't need your stubbornness. He wants your surrender. He's not impressed by how much you endure. He moves when you obey, because there's more honor in leaving at the right time than in staying until you collapse. There's more faith in letting go of what God asked than in continuing until everything burns inside. God doesn't want to see you fade away. He doesn't want your life to be a battlefield. He never asked you to fight. He wants your rest, your lightness, his awakening presence. Because what he has for you isn't where you insist. It's where you trust enough to let go. And only those who let go see the new, being born. Because while you cling to what's already ended, your hands can't receive what God has prepared to begin anew. The spiritual fatigue that reveals you're in the wrong place. Have you ever tried to pray and the words wouldn't come? Have you ever opened the Bible and it seemed silent? Have you ever tried to serve and everything inside you cried out for rest? This isn't ordinary weariness, it's spiritual weariness. And it carries a silent cry that few have the courage to hear. This journey is over. There's a difference between being tired from fighting the right battles and being exhausted from insisting where God no longer wants you. The first kind of tiredness is rewarded with renewal, the second only with emptiness. And you feel it in your body, soul, and spirit, because even trying to maintain your routine of faith, your devotion, your love for God, something inside you no longer responds as it once did. And that's where many get confused. They think this discouragement is a spiritual attack, that it's the enemy trying to steal their strength. But not all exhaustion comes from hell. Some comes from a deviation from purpose, from remaining in places that were once fertile but are now dry land, from insisting on bearing fruit where the root has already rotted. And this isn't weakness, it's alertness. Elijah felt this weight, a fiery prophet, a man of his word. But at one point, he felt so exhausted that he fled. He went into the desert. He asked to die, because even though he served God, his heart could no longer bear the place he was. And God, in his compassion, didn't rebuke him, didn't call him ungrateful. He simply took him out. He fed him. He repositioned him. He sent him anew. Because even the most faithful can lose their way when the weight becomes greater than their direction. So ask yourself honestly, does this place still nourish your faith, or does it just drain your energy? Does this routine, this calling, this surrender still have life, or are they just an empty repetition of something that's already passed? Because God didn't call you to drag yourself along every day. He called you to walk with purpose, with presence, with peace. Sometimes the soul cries out silently. It no longer wants the same. It can no longer bear the burden of appearing faithful when everything is already disconnected. And if you listen to this cry, not with guilt, but with discernment, you will realize it is not a deviation. It is an An invitation to escape from weariness and return to the center of God's will. An invitation to rediscover yourself. An invitation to begin again. Because God's presence does not exhaust us, it renews us. And if there is no renewal, perhaps it is time to leave, not out of rebellion, but out of obedience to the rest the Father wants to give you. When God calls for a new beginning, you've made it this far, and perhaps you've realized that you're not tired because of a lack of faith, but because of excessive persistence. You're not lost because you've turned away from God, but because you tried too hard to stay where He no longer wanted you. And now, with your heart exposed, your soul silent, and your eyes open, something inside you begins to accept this isn't the end of faith, it's the end of a cycle. You tried like few others would. You carried, you prayed, you endured, you believed, and God saw. He saw every gesture, every swallowed tear, every prayer offered with a trembling voice. Every night you said amen without knowing if you were being heard, and you were. God heard you. He just didn't answer as you expected, because He didn't want to keep you where you were. He wanted to pull you to where you needed to be. It's not punishment, it's redirection. It's not rejection, it's preparation. God is allowing you to feel this emptiness, not because He's abandoned you, but because He's emptying you of what no longer serves you, to fill you with new purpose. He's closing doors, removing people, removing you from places that were once important, but not eternal. Because those who live guided by the Spirit need to learn that not all permanence is faithfulness. Sometimes it's fear disguised as faith. You don't need to insist anymore. God has given you permission to stop saving everyone. He has given you the authority to end cycles that only remain open because you're afraid of disappointing. And today, perhaps, is the confirmation your heart has been waiting for. God is saying, you didn't make a mistake in loving, but now I ask you, love yourself enough to obey me. There is no condemnation here, only liberation, only comfort, only direction. Because heaven is making room for the new, and this new begins when you let go of what consumes you and embrace what renews you, not in haste, not with guilt, but with the firmness of someone who understands that obedience is also rest. God is not silent. He is calling you, not to prove you can handle it, but to show that when you let go, He sustains. When you stop, He begins. And when you obey, even what seemed like the end becomes a new beginning. Because with God, the end of a path is always the beginning of a new direction. And that direction is waiting for you. If this message spoke to you, don't let it get lost in the noise of the day. Listen again, pray with it, write down what God showed you, because when heaven whispers, the soul needs to be attentive. Share this with someone who's tired but still doesn't understand why. Someone who needs to hear that it's not a lack of faith, it's time to obey. This may be the answer someone has been silently asking for a long time. And if this word was a relief to you, subscribe to the channel. Here, each video is an invitation to discernment, rest, and healing, because you are not alone on this journey. God is guiding you, and we are here to remind you of that. Until the next video, and may the peace that moves you be greater than the fear that paralyzes you.